November 8, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. 0547 hours. Staff Sergeant James Delmont pressed his back against the shattered trunk of a beech tree, bark fragments mixing with the mud caked across his uniform. The fog hung so thick between the trees that he couldn't see more than 15 feet in any direction. Somewhere in that gray void, a German MG-42 had his squad pinned, the distinctive sound like ripping canvas, 1,200 rounds per minute chewing through the forest canopy above them. He'd been in combat for 4 months. Normandy beaches, hedgerows, Paris liberation. But nothing had prepared him for this. The Hürtgen was different. It swallowed men whole. 3 of his squad were already down, and they'd advanced maybe 200 yards in 6 hours. Then the artillery started. Not German artillery, American. The sound was different, controlled, precise. Walking barrage, moving forward in 100-yard increments, the shells arriving with metronomic regularity. Delmont had seen plenty of artillery fire, but never like this. This was surgery. "That's Simpson's work," his lieutenant shouted over the concussions. "Ninth Army. They say the Krauts call him der Feldherr, the commander." Delmont didn't know who Simpson was. He just knew that for the first time since entering this green hell, the artillery was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, and the MG-42 had gone silent. In the pantheon of American military commanders in World War II, certain names dominate the historical consciousness. Eisenhower, the supreme diplomat strategist. Bradley, the soldier's general. Patton, the swaggering cavalryman whose pearl-handled revolvers and profane brilliance made him a household name. But there was another general, one whose name has faded from popular memory, despite being, by almost every objective measure, the most consistently successful American field commander in the European theater. His name was William Hood Simpson, and by late 1944, German intelligence considered him the most dangerous American general on the Western Front. Not Patton, Simpson. The German assessment wasn't based on mythology or personality. It was based on something far more terrifying: consistent, methodical, devastating competence. Lieutenant General William Hood Simpson commanded the U.S. Ninth Army, and between September 1944 and May 1945, his force executed some of the most difficult operations of the war with a precision that German commanders found deeply unsettling. While Patton grabbed headlines with dramatic breakthroughs and quotable bombast, Simpson's Ninth Army was systematically dismantling German defensive positions with an effectiveness that made Wehrmacht officers curse his name in their command bunkers. General Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, wrote in a December 1944 report to OKW, "The American Ninth Army demonstrates a level of operational sophistication and artillery coordination that exceeds any enemy force we have encountered. Where Patton attacks with passion, Simpson attacks with mathematics. The mathematics are more frightening." William Hood Simpson was born in 1888 in Weatherford, Texas, a small town that produced an unusually large number of military officers. He graduated from West Point in 1909, part of a class that would generate dozens of World War II commanders. His classmates remembered him as unremarkable: solid grades, good athlete, quiet demeanor. No one predicted greatness. But Simpson possessed something that wouldn't become apparent until decades later: an almost supernatural ability to manage complexity. World War I saw him serving in staff positions on the Mexican border. He never saw combat. Between the wars, he moved through the standard progression of peacetime Army assignments: instructor positions, staff college, various administrative posts. By 1940, at age 52, he was a colonel commanding a regiment. Most officers his age were heading toward retirement. Then the war came, and the Army needed generals. Fast. Simpson received his first star in 1941, his second in 1943. He took command of the Ninth Army, then still forming in the United States, in May 1944. By September, his force was operational in Europe, initially positioned to support the First Army's advance through Belgium. What Simpson brought to command wasn't charisma or tactical brilliance in the traditional sense. He brought something the American military machine desperately needed: systems thinking. Colonel Trevor Dupois, military historian and systems analyst, later wrote, "Simpson understood modern warfare as an engineering problem, not in a cold, mechanical sense, but in recognizing that victory emerged from the integration of thousands of variables: logistics, intelligence, fire support, infantry armor coordination,
air-ground cooperation, replacement flows, maintenance cycles. He saw the whole machine. And Simpson's machine ran with terrifying efficiency. December 1945. Planning rooms. 9th Army Headquarters, Maastricht, Netherlands. While Patton's Third Army was driving toward Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge, drawing every headline and newsreel camera, Simpson's 9th Army was preparing for one of the most technically difficult operations of the Western Front, crossing the Roer River in winter conditions against heavily fortified German positions. The Roer presented a unique problem. It wasn't particularly wide, maybe 100 feet in most places, but the Germans controlled dams upstream. If they blew those dams at the right moment, they could turn the river into a flood that would trap American forces on the far bank, isolated and vulnerable to counterattack. It was a tactical nightmare. Simpson's staff spent 6 weeks planning the crossing with obsessive detail. They studied German defensive doctrine, analyzed every piece of intelligence on enemy dispositions, calculated artillery requirements down to the individual battery, planned medical evacuation routes, established supply dumps, coordinated with tactical air forces, and developed contingency plans for 17 different scenarios. Major Robert Hamilton, a staff officer who participated in the planning, later recalled, "The old man wanted answers to questions we hadn't thought to ask. What's the soil composition on the far bank? Will it support tank traffic after winter rains? What's the replacement rate we need to sustain operations for 3 weeks? If the Germans counterattack with armor from the north, how long until our tank destroyers can reposition?" He was pleasant about it, almost gentle, but he wanted answers. The artillery plan alone was a masterwork. Simpson's artillery officer, Brigadier General Charles Hart, developed a fire support system that integrated divisional artillery, corps artillery, and Army-level heavy guns into a single coordinated instrument. The plan allocated over 2,000 artillery pieces, the largest concentration the U.S. Army had assembled for a single operation in Europe. On February 23, 1945, Operation Grenade commenced.
February 23, 1945. 0245 hours, east bank of the Roer River. Oberst Heinrich Voits commanded the 363rd Volksgrenadier Division, dug into positions along the Roer's eastern bank. A veteran of the Eastern Front, he'd fought through Stalingrad, Kursk, the retreat through Ukraine. He'd seen Soviet artillery preparations that lasted days, massed tank assaults, the full weight of Red Army fury. Nothing had prepared him for what Simpson unleashed. The American barrage opened with stunning violence. Not the scattered, uncoordinated fire Voits had experienced from other American units, but something fundamentally different. A rolling storm of high explosive that moved across German positions with mechanical precision. His post-war interrogation report describes it. "The artillery fire was unlike anything in my experience. It did not arrive in waves or volleys, but as a continuous pressure. Every battery was firing to a precisely calculated schedule. Counter-battery fire suppressed our artillery within 15 minutes. Forward positions received systematic destruction, not random shelling, but methodical elimination of each strongpoint in sequence. We could not mass for counterattack because their fire followed our movements. They were not guessing our positions. They knew." The 9th Army's artillery fired over 1,000 rounds per minute for the first hour, 45,000 shells in 60 minutes. The coordination was so precise that infantry assault boats crossed the river under a moving curtain of explosions that stayed exactly 200 yards ahead of them as they advanced. German officers reported something else. American artillery began targeting command posts and communication centers within minutes of the assault beginning. Not through random luck, through systematic intelligence work. Simpson's staff had spent weeks analyzing every piece of information to build a target list that would collapse German command and control. Hauptmann Wilhelm Preuss, a company commander in the 363rd, survived the crossing. His memoir provides a ground-level view. "We could not communicate. Our telephone lines were cut immediately. Radio messages could not get through. We learned later the Americans had jammed our frequencies. Our battalion commander was killed in the first 20 minutes. His replacement lasted 10 minutes before his bunker received a direct hit. We did not know what was happening 100 meters away, let alone across the division front. We fought as isolated groups, disconnected. That was their plan." By 1800 hours on February 23rd, the 9th Army had 4 divisions across the Roer with secure bridgeheads.
German defensive positions that should have held for days collapsed in hours. The German military kept meticulous records, and those records reveal something remarkable. By early 1945, Wehrmacht intelligence services were tracking Simpson's operations with the same level of attention they devoted to Soviet offensives on the Eastern Front. A March 1945 assessment from Army Group B headquarters identified Simpson's Ninth Army as the primary threat to the northern sector. Not Montgomery's 21st Army Group, which included British, Canadian, and American forces. Not Patton's Third Army, which was smashing through central Germany. Simpson's Ninth Army. Why? General Gunther Blumentritt, who served as chief of staff to several senior commanders on the Western Front, explained in post-war interviews. Patton would take great risks. He would overextend, create vulnerabilities. If you could survive his initial assault, you might find opportunities to counterattack his exposed flanks. Montgomery was cautious, predictable. You could calculate his movements days in advance. Simpson was different. His operations had the thoroughness of Montgomery, with the speed of Patton, but without the weaknesses of either. He would not overextend. He would not pause when momentum favored advance. His logistics were impeccable. We never caught him with supply lines vulnerable. His intelligence was extraordinary. He seemed to anticipate our movements before we made them. And his artillery, Gott im Himmel, his artillery made every position death. This wasn't propaganda or post-war myth-making. Contemporary German documents support Blumentritt's assessment. A February 1945 intelligence summary circulated to German army commanders included a section titled American Command Assessment. It ranked U.S. generals by operational threat level. Simpson, Ninth Army. Extreme threat. Recommend priority intelligence collection and spoiling attacks to disrupt preparations. Hodges, First Army. Significant threat. Competent, methodical. Patton, Third Army. Dangerous but manageable. Relies on momentum. Vulnerable to determined resistance and flank counterattacks. The document noted that Simpson's forces consistently achieved objectives on schedule, maintained operational security that prevented German intelligence from determining his intentions, and demonstrated industrial-scale efficiency in combat operations. Colonel Hans von Luck, who commanded units against multiple American generals, was blunt in his assessment. Patton was the most famous, but Simpson was the one who cost us the most. You could make Patton angry, provoke him into mistakes. Simpson couldn't be provoked. He had a plan, and he executed the plan, and nothing we did seemed to disrupt it. March 24, 1945. Rhine River, northern Germany. If the Rohr crossing demonstrated Simpson's planning capabilities, the Rhine assault showcased them on a larger canvas. The Rhine, the greatest natural barrier in Western Europe. Hitler had declared it the final defensive line. The Germans had spent months fortifying the western bank, and the river itself was nearly 1,500 feet wide in places, with strong currents that could swamp assault boats. Simpson's Ninth Army was tasked with crossing as part of Operation Plunder, coordinated with Montgomery's 21st Army Group. It would be the largest combined river crossing since D-Day, larger in some respects, involving more troops in the initial assault than had landed on any single Normandy beach. The planning consumed 2 months. Simpson's staff coordinated with the British on everything from artillery fire plans to medical evacuation procedures. They accumulated 60,000 tons of ammunition, 30,000 tons of engineering equipment, and positioned 3 divisions for the initial assault with 4 more ready to exploit the bridgehead. The artillery preparation involved 3,300 guns, British and American, firing a synchronized barrage that German survivors described as apocalyptic. For 3 hours before the assault, the barrage maintained a rate of fire that put 1 shell every 6 seconds on every 500 square yards of German defensive positions. Private First Class George Mitchell, 30th Infantry Division, was in the 3rd wave of assault boats. You couldn't hear anything but explosions, couldn't see the far shore through the smoke. The boat crews knew exactly where to land. Somebody had mapped every yard of that riverbank. We hit the shore, and the artillery shifted forward exactly as we moved, like they could see us, even though I know they couldn't. Everything worked. Every single thing worked the way they said it would. Within 24 hours, the Ninth Army had 10 divisions across the Ruhr with secure bridgeheads. German defensive positions that should have held for days collapsed in hours. German counterattacks, carefully prepared, drawing on reserve units, ran into pre-positioned American forces that seemed to be expecting them. Because they were. Major General Richard von Rosen, who commanded one of the counterattacking formations, was captured 3 days after the crossing. His interrogation is revealing. We attempted to mass our forces for a coordinated strike against what intelligence indicated was the American northern flank. When we moved into our attack positions, we came under immediate artillery fire, not exploratory fire, direct, targeted fire that struck our command posts and supply columns. Within 2 hours, the attack was impossible. Later we learned the Americans had been waiting for us. They knew we were coming before we arrived.
What made Simpson's Ninth Army so consistently effective? The answer lies in understanding how he built and managed his command. First, personnel selection. Simpson chose his subordinates with obsessive care. He wanted division commanders who were competent professionals, not glory seekers. He wanted staff officers who understood that warfare was 90% logistics and planning, 10% heroics. He fired officers who couldn't meet his standards, not dramatically, not publicly, but efficiently. Major General Leland Hobbs, who commanded the 30th Infantry Division under Simpson, later said, "The old man didn't give you impossible orders. He gave you difficult orders with the resources to accomplish them. If you needed more artillery support, you got it. If you needed more engineers, they showed up. If you said you needed another day to prepare, he listened, but you better have a damn good reason." Second, integration of combat arms. Simpson insisted on training his infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers to work as a unified system. Divisions conducted combined arms exercises even during active operations. The Ninth Army developed standardized procedures for infantry armor cooperation that became models for the entire U.S. Army. Third, intelligence and planning. Simpson's G2, intelligence, and G3, operations, sections worked in unprecedented coordination. Every operation began with comprehensive intelligence preparation, terrain analysis, enemy strength and disposition, weather forecasting, civil affairs considerations. Operations orders were detailed but flexible, with clearly defined objectives and commander's intent that allowed subordinates to adapt to changing circumstances. Fourth, fire support. Simpson elevated artillery to the primary killing arm of his force. His artillery officer, General Hart, implemented a fire support coordination system that integrated every artillery piece in the Ninth Army into a single responsive network. Forward observers could call for fire from divisional batteries, corps batteries, or Army-level heavy artillery with equal ease. Response times averaged under 3 minutes from request to first rounds on target. Fifth, logistics. Simpson understood that ammunition, fuel, and replacements determined operational tempo. He maintained supply reserves that allowed sustained operations regardless of weather or enemy interdiction. His logistics officers tracked consumption rates daily and projected requirements weeks in advance. Colonel Bruce Clark, who commanded an armored division in the Ninth Army, summarized it, "Simpson's army felt organized. You weren't fighting the enemy and your own supply system simultaneously. You weren't wondering if the artillery would show up or if the engineers had the bridging equipment. Everything worked. It was like fighting with the safety on. You could focus on the Germans because everything behind you was handled." There's a darker side to this story, one that explains in part why Simpson never achieved Patton's fame. Simpson was boring. He didn't give fiery speeches. He didn't wear distinctive uniforms or carry ivory-handled pistols. He didn't slap soldiers or threaten to shoot deserters. He didn't provide good copy for war correspondents looking for dramatic personalities. Ernie Pyle, the most famous American war correspondent, visited Simpson headquarters in late 1944. His unpublished notes, found in his papers decades later, reveal his frustration. General Simpson is competent, professional, thorough, and completely uninteresting. He speaks in measured tones about artillery coordinates and supply schedules. His soldiers respect him, but they don't tell stories about him. There's no drama here, just methodology. This won't make good reading. Pyle went south to cover Patton instead. The result? History remembers the general who provided dramatic quotes and photogenic moments, not the one who consistently won with minimal casualties. And casualty rates matter. Here's the statistical reality. Between September 1944 and May 1945, the Ninth Army suffered approximately 27,000 killed, wounded, and missing, about 15% lower per operational day than the Third Army.
despite executing comparably difficult missions. Simpson's casualty ratio, enemy casualties inflicted versus friendly casualties sustained, was the highest of any American army in Europe. Those numbers represent thousands of men who went home instead of dying, thousands of families who got their sons, brothers, and fathers back. But statistics don't make for compelling narratives, and Simpson's methodical competence didn't fit the warrior-hero archetype that journalists and historians preferred. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bosch, who fought under Simpson, wrote in his memoir, "We knew we were in a well-run army. We knew the old man wouldn't waste us on suicide missions or glory charges. Maybe that's not exciting to read about, but when you're the guy who might die, competence matters more than charisma." April 1945, Northern Germany. By mid-April, the war in Europe was effectively over. German resistance was collapsing on all fronts. The Ninth Army was driving east through the Ruhr industrial region, encircling Army Group B in what would be the largest mass surrender of German forces to Western allies, over 325,000 prisoners. Then came the order that defines Simpson's historical footnote status: halt at the Elbe River. Simpson's forces had reached the Elbe on April 11th. Berlin lay 53 miles to the east. The road was open. German resistance between the Elbe and Berlin was minimal. Simpson's intelligence indicated that the Ninth Army could be in Berlin within 48 hours. He requested permission to advance. Eisenhower refused. The decision had been made at the highest political levels. Berlin would be left to the Soviets. American forces would halt at the Elbe and consolidate positions. Strategic considerations, post-war political arrangements, zones of occupation, the need to avoid accidental conflicts between American and Soviet forces outweighed operational opportunity. Simpson's response was professional, disciplined, and correct. "I understand and will comply." But those who were there remember his reaction. Major General James Gavin, visiting Ninth Army headquarters when the order arrived, recalled, "Simpson put down the phone and just sat there for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, 'We could have been in Berlin in 2 days.'" He never complained, never argued, never publicly questioned the decision. But you could see it cost him. Patton, in similar circumstances, would have raged and protested, and likely would have been overruled anyway, but the dramatic protest would have entered the historical record. Simpson simply obeyed, and history forgot the question. The Ninth Army spent the final weeks of the war securing its sector, processing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and preparing for occupation duties. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Simpson's force was positioned along the Elbe, having advanced farther east than any Western Allied army. In June 1945, as the Army began planning for the invasion of Japan, Simpson was designated to command one of the field armies for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. It was recognition of his competence. You don't give invasion commands to mediocre generals. The atomic bombs ended the war before downfall became necessary. Simpson remained in Europe through 1946, commanding occupation forces. He retired in 1946 at mandatory retirement age, received the Distinguished Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his wartime service, and returned to Texas. His retirement was quiet. He gave occasional speeches to veterans groups, but he didn't write memoirs or campaign for historical recognition. He died in 1980 at age 92, largely forgotten outside military history circles. The question remains, why did German commanders fear Simpson more than Patton? The answer lies in understanding what armies actually fear. They don't fear dramatic gestures or quotable generals. They fear effectiveness. They fear the commander who will methodically dismantle their defenses, whose operations they cannot disrupt, whose logistics they cannot interdict with enough accuracy to counter. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served on multiple staffs on the Western Front, wrote in his post-war assessment, "Patton's personality was impressive, his operational dash intimidating, but dash creates opportunities for the defender. Speed without logistics creates vulnerabilities. Aggression without systematic preparation can be channeled and countered." Simpson offered no such opportunities. His operations were comprehensive. He considered logistics, intelligence, fire support, reserve positioning, medical evacuation, civil affairs, everything. When the Ninth Army attacked, it did so with such complete preparation that resistance became a mathematical question.
San Antonio, Texas, 1965. 20 years after the war ended, a young Army officer doing research on the Roar River crossing tracked down retired General William Simpson at his home in Texas. The officer wanted to understand how the operation had been planned and executed with such precision. Simpson invited him in, offered coffee, and spent 3 hours walking through the operation, not boasting, just explaining. Maps spread across the dining room table, the old general's hands moving across terrain features, discussing artillery fans of fire, logistics timelines, intelligence preparation. At the end, the young officer asked the question that had puzzled historians. "Sir, why didn't you get the recognition you deserved? Why didn't people understand what you accomplished?" Simpson was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. The same quiet smile his staff officers remembered from command briefings 3 decades earlier. "Son," he said, "the objective was never recognition. The objective was winning the war while bringing as many of our boys home as possible. We accomplished the objective. That's sufficient." The officer left with pages of notes that would become part of the Army's institutional knowledge on combined arms operations. Simpson never sought credit for it. Patton's swagger made better copy than Simpson's methodology. The pearl-handled revolvers photographed better than artillery coordination charts. But in the moment, in the winter mud of the Ruhr Valley, in the smoke-filled command bunkers across the Rhine, in the desperate calculations of German officers trying to stop American advances, Simpson's reputation was crystal clear. He was the general they feared most, not because he inspired fear through personality, but because he delivered something far more terrifying: inevitable victory. The soldiers who served under him understood. Staff Sergeant James Delmont, who survived the Hurtgen Forest and fought through to the Elbe, said it simply in a 1989 interview. "I didn't know General Simpson personally, never met him, but I knew his artillery always came when we needed it. I knew the supplies showed up. I knew the plans made sense. When you're doing the fighting, that matters more than quotable speeches." Patton was famous. Simpson was effective. If I had to go back and do it again, I'd choose effective every time. The German High Command, calculating threats in their final desperate months, made the same choice in their assessments. They feared the man who made war into mathematics, because mathematics, unlike courage or luck or dramatic gestures, cannot be countered by willpower alone. They feared William Hood Simpson because he represented the industrial, systematic application of military power against which no amount of tactical brilliance or defensive fortification could prevail. They feared him because in the end he was unbeatable.